But let's talk a little bit about Amos. Amos is unique as a prophet in the sense that he was not trained as a prophet or a priest. He didn't undergo training from the big name prophets at all. In fact, several prophets that are called by God did not actually receive formal training. It was something that God laid on their heart as a result of their life that they lived, right? And Amos admits to this in chapter 7, referring to himself, saying, I was no prophet, nor a prophet's son, but I was a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore figs. So he was a shepherd and a fig tree farmer. And one scholar, I love what he pointed out with this, because he says that Amos used the unusual terms to describe his trade instead of calling himself a shepherd, as was common at the time, right? He described himself as a sheep raiser by literal terms. And the scholar wrote this. He said, Amos probably chose this title to emphasize the fact that he was really a shepherd of sheep, not someone who was trained in a shepherd sense, symbolic sense of being spiritual guidance. So he is claiming to have none of that, right? In other words, once again, don't miss the reality of what God is saying in this through Amos. God shows that he calls seemingly ordinary people, untrained people, to do extraordinary things, right? Never does God discount us to be used in a mighty way, but we discount ourselves. We disqualify ourselves. We make excuses for ourselves. Amos didn't do that. He admitted, but he still allowed God to use him in a mighty way. If I could make that an insight, there you go. There's a massive insight right off the bat. So Amos came from Tekoa, which was in southern kingdom in Judah, but God calls him to deliver a message to the northern kingdom. And his ministry, if you want to further research, fits in between 2 Kings 14 through 15, where he served under King Uzziah and Jeroboam. Okay. So many scholars referred to him as a straight shooter, like no fluff, no buff, right? For example, in chapter 4, verse 1, he calls the women, I'm paraphrasing, fat cows who boss around their husbands. So he was not trained to be eloquent in his speech or whatever. But that gives you a taste, like I said, of his no fluff or buff style of prophesying, right? So he served as a prophet approximately 150 years after Israel had divided. So they've had time to separate and start doing their own things, right? And even kind of rival each other. So just think about that when he's going from the southern kingdom to the northern kingdom to carry out his assignment. But in Hebrew, the name Amos means burden or burden bearer. And that's extremely important, understanding his reality as he approaches the northern kingdom. In today's culture, we don't really know the meaning behind everyone's name, but in that culture, you intentionally name someone based on the meaning of their name. Everyone would know that Amos as a kid was a burden. That's how he would be grown up to be revealed as. But the intentionality for his name would be that he would carry the burden of responsibility of the lost and broken nature of Israel. So Amos's assignment, he was called to go to Bethel to speak against the social injustices that had developed, as well as the idol worship. Do you remember we talked about Jeroboam last year, who was the king, who first was the king, and he disobeyed by setting up temples for worship at both Dan and Bethel, right? As rival centers to the worship center in Jerusalem, right? Which was the true place of worship. Which is why one of the first things Amos says in chapter 1, verse 2 is, the Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem. So Amos is starting off basically reminding all of Israel, of the northern kingdom, where the center of true worship is. And y'all ain't got it. You have gotten it wrong. And then he also, in that first couple of verses, says the top of Carmel withers. So Mount Carmel is where Elijah dramatically confronts and defeats the prophets of Baal. Remember? Amos was reminding them not only was Jerusalem the center of worship, but also reminding them of God's previous victory over idolatry. Yet here we are again. So it's kind of a precursor of God's done it once. He's going to do it again. Y'all are back in idol worship. Do you not get the message? Okay. So let's talk about the culture that Amos faced. So much of what has happened in the spiritual decline of the northern kingdom was because of these false places of worship where golden calves were placed by King Jeroboam, right? However, they had at this time a powerful military and political force. They were very wealthy as a nation at this point. So they were encountering wealth and prosperity, and they got these big heads, both in their physical strength as a nation and independence of their own style of worship, idolatry. And all of this led to a serious disease of injustice and oppression of the poor. That is the biggest thing that Amos is addressing here. There was widespread immorality, and the judicial system was extremely corrupt. But interestingly enough, though the people interpreted their prosperity as signs of God's blessing. They're like, we're doing all this stuff right, so he's blessing us with military and wealth and all of these things. And Amos was tasked with delivering the opposite truth, that they were actually displeased in God's eyes. God was displeased with them and with the nation, and God's patience had been exhausted and punishment was now inevitable. And we'll talk about that in a minute. The nation would be destroyed without a serious change of heart. Because everyone in this room, let's talk about prosperity for a minute. We are prosperous by world standards, right? All of us in this room are prosperous by world standards. And we have the ability or the prerequisite of setting ourselves up to deceive ourselves into believing that we also have been blessed by God with our material gains or our life career accomplishments, right? The tendency to give God credit for material goods and believe we have satisfied him is always with us. Material prosperity can often lead to religious and moral corruption. We have to define what blessings are and truly what God has given us as blessings. Go back to the Sermon on the Mount. Did God ever say, I bless you with materialism? No. Blessings in God's eyes are very different. And the Israelites got it wrong. And I think that's something we should caution ourselves with too. We could get that wrong too. Throughout the book of Amos, he stresses injustice in the courts, idolatry, prostitution in the temple, and gain from extortion of the poor, all while celebrating themselves for doing so. They were having parties in the streets for all that they were accomplishing against oppressing the poor. So a basic overview of the book, Amos is a collection of sermons, its poems, and its visions that he had over the course of his ministry. So we're going to break it down into those three sections. Chapters 1 through 2 are expressions of the burdens that Amos carries, and the message isn't just for Israel. Because this is so interesting when you're reading through the first chapter. Amos starts by addressing 6 different nations surrounding Israel, but starts with Damascus, saying, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment. So it's weird verbiage, right? For 3 transgressions of Damascus and for 4. The language of 3 sins and then 4 is simply referencing that there has been sin upon sin upon sin that God is now done with and will not tolerate anymore. So he repeats this phrase for the other nations, Gaza, Tyre, Edom, Ammon, and Moab. And he deals with each of their transgressions, including violence and injustice and a coming judgment. Okay. It's odd because the opening verse says Amos will speak against Israel, but as he names all of these nations, if you look at them on a map, you see that he's creating this circle around Israel. This creates a picture as if Israel is like a target that is in the crosshairs of all of these pagan nations. And God is speaking to the pagan nations through Amos. And these are nations that all messed with Israel, and God is sending them a message as well. He's basically saying, if you mess with Israel, you mess with God, you mess with me. And God in return will mess back with you with the final word, okay? So think about it. Where are the Babylonians today that messed with the Israel people? Where are the Canaanites? Where are the Philistines? They no longer exist, right? They're gone. So God is giving them that warning to them as pagan nations. And we know that Satan has spent his existence after being cast out of heaven to bring up nations to destroy God's people. We've seen it throughout history. And God has always dealt with them and will continue to deal with them harshly. We need to be on the side of Israel, right? So here Amos is in Bethel, starting his speech with the judgment against all these other nations. Like all these other nations that the people of the northern kingdom are listening, and they're like, yeah, go Amos, preach it. That's awesome. I love what you're saying. But then chapter 2, verse 4, Amos gets a little too close to home because he says, for 3 transgressions of Judah, his own hometown, the home of Amos, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment because they have rejected the law of the Lord and have not kept his statutes. But their lies have led them astray, those after which their fathers walked. So I will send a fire upon Judah, and it shall devour the strongholds of Jerusalem. Now remember, there's a little rivalry. But for a southern kingdom guy to come up and say this to the northern kingdom, they're like, oh, maybe he's on our side, right? It's remarkable to see that the same judgment formula applied against Judah, the people of God, was also applied against the 6 previous Gentile nations. It shows that Judah, like the pagan nations, were living sin upon sin upon sin in the same manner as the pagan nations. They were no different. They had not set themselves apart. And one scholar wrote this: we find it easy and comfortable to expose and rebuke the sins of those who aren't followers of God. That is what Amos did with his first 6 pronouncement of judgment. But just as Amos went on to look at the sin among God's people, we should do the same. We are accountable to each other, right? We can't give each other as followers of Jesus a pass on sin. And that's it. Amos's message is you don't get a pass either. But now this southern prophet brings it home to the northern kingdom in verse 6, chapter 2. For 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. Those who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth and turn aside the way of the afflicted. He accuses them of a lack of compassion and mercy on the poor, allowing them to be sold into debt slavery. We read about that, and denying them, the poor, any legal representation. Notice in your Bibles, if you have them, that all the attacks of accusations on Israel is 3 times longer and more intense than any of the other nations that Amos had addressed before. So God means business with the northern kingdom of Israel right now. And chapters 3 through 6 explain why he's more intense and why punishment is more intense. So chapters 3 through 6 are a collection of poems expressing the same message. Chapter 3 verse 1 says, hear this word that the Lord has spoken against you, O people of Israel, against the whole family that I brought up out of the land of Egypt. You only have I known of all the families of the earth. Therefore, I will punish you for all of your iniquities. So here God is pleading for righteousness driven by relationship. Amos asked them, is this the family once denied justice in Egypt? The family that God rescued from oppression and slavery, that are now imposing that same dreadful hardship on others and on their own people, right? God says, because you are my chosen people, because you made a covenant with me, you will now be judged. You, O Israel, were to be a blessing. You were to be given a great responsibility, and you continue to fail. One scholar wrote this, and I love his phrasing. He says, if Israel thought that their standing as a special chosen nation made them less responsible before God, they were tragically mistaken. But that seems to be their arrogant attitude often, right? So chapter 4 talks about how God tried to get their attention. Chapter 4, verses 6 through 10 reminds them that God had sent famine. God withheld rain. God struck the gardens and vineyards. He sent plagues that were identical to the ones that they saw in Egypt, again referring to Egypt, all hoping it would enable them to see the hand of God and correlate all of these events to his power and his presence. Yet there was no response and no repentance. Yet, as always, in chapter 5, God inserts a remedy. And this is considered a lamentation over Israel. God tells them, again, like we heard with Joel, you have nothing left to do but cry out, right? Stop seeking religious gatherings. Stop offering sacrifices, all while ignoring God's heart for the poor. That's the underlying message here. And stop the idolatry. Instead, chapter 5, verse 4, he says, seek me and live. Chapter 5, verse 14, God calls them to seek good and not evil that you may live. And so the Lord, the God of hosts, will be with you. Their seeking good is dependent on the presence of God, is their seeking God and seeking good, right? They became a nation that measured their standard of righteousness by immoral gods who they were worshiping, who don't require a standard of righteousness, right? They self-determined what was right and what was wrong, and there was no positive or godly transformation, only negative, ungodly transformation. Their definition of good and evil did not align with God's definition. And Amos goes even deeper and tells them that their idol worship has all been a sham. It is a show. It is a deception. In fact, Amos speaks for God, saying this about their worship activities in verses 21 and 23. He says, I despise your feasts, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the peace offerings of your fattened animals, I will not look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. To the melody of your harps, I will not listen. These are strong words. They thought they were doing all the right things, but they did not have the heart behind it. God says, I'm not going to hear this because they're being offered to false gods. They're not even being offered to me. Because they, at the time, worshiped the God of war, the God of weather, the God of sex, the God of pleasure, all allowing for injustice to be justified and run rampant. So God, through Amos, calls them to true worship. Being a God of compassion and mercy, he reveals that instead what they need to do is turn back to true worship. Seek me, seek good. And in verse 24, he says, this is a very key verse of what God is calling them, and by extension, us too as well. He says, but let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. In other words, one scholar beautifully defined it, and I put it on your outline because it was so powerful. Righteousness in Hebrew is, I'm going to butcher it, tzedakah, which means right, equitable relationships between people, no matter their social differences. Justice in Hebrew is mishpah and refers to concrete actions that you take to correct injustice and create righteousness. Both are to permeate God's people like a rushing water in a dry river bed. In other words, true worship of God has nothing to do with all the rituals that we think or Israel at the time especially thought aligned them with God. It was synonymous. True worship is synonymous with doing good, with generosity and justice and compassion. Chapter 6 is a stern warning. Verses 1, 3, and 6, I'll combine those a little bit. He says, woe to those who are at ease in Zion. And I'll come back to that in a minute. O you who put far away the day of disaster and bring near the seat of violence, who drink wine in bowls and anoint themselves with the finest oils, but are not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. They're not grieved over the people that are being oppressed by them. So the word woe here suggests a warning to slow down and ponder what really matters. It isn't the luxury you're enjoying when he says those who are at ease. Woe to those who are at ease. You think that your luxury that you're enjoying should be your focus, but rather the judgment to come should be your focus. And then finally, chapters 7 through 9 are visions given by God, Amos experienced, depicting the coming judgment on Israel. And I'm just going to briefly call out what these visions were. The first, he saw a swarm of locusts. We know what that means, right? It's so disturbing. This vision is so disturbing to Amos that he cries out to God and he intercedes for mercy. God, they're so small. Don't do this to these people. And this caused his prayer, caused God to relent. Why? Because Amos said a prayer. Amos had a burden for the people. Never underestimate the power of prayer, because the second vision comes along and it was of a fire coming because of a drought. This fire was to destroy the material possessions, but also be a purifying work of God in every believer, right? Because God's spiritual fire is to burn away those things that are in us that are unworthy, right? But once again, this vision is so devastating to Amos that he is moved by compassion and pity, and again prays for mercy for the people. He had a burden for these people, and God relents. The next vision changes. It's almost like, okay, I will relent, but here's what they have to do. Because the third vision was a plumb line. This is an ancient tool used to make like a wall straight when they're building something, right? Like our current level. They would hang this weight at the end of the rope and build along the rope to make sure that the wall stayed crooked and didn't stray, okay? So God is judging his people based on the straight edge of his truth, is what he's telling them, okay? He basically, one scholar said, I am inserting myself in their lives as a plumb line, a measure of righteousness, a measurement of truth. If not aligned, then the people should see that they have become a crooked generation. Specific verbiage that is used. So then the fourth vision was a basket of summer fruit, which was ripe for reaping. This is a reference to the second coming. I heard someone once say that this vision in chapter 8 is like movie trailers of what is to come. It's snippets of the larger picture, right? You get all the most important parts that draw you in and are supposed to make you want to know the whole story. And that's what this is doing. He's trying to tell them, here's snippets of it. You need to know what that second coming looks like. You need to know the whole picture. And then the fifth and final vision, Amos sees God striking the idol temple at Bethel, causing it to crumble to ashes. Remember when we studied Jeroboam, that happened, right? It is depicting Israel as a destroyed building. But as with Hosea and as with Joel, God uses Amos to promise the house of David will be restored in the end. God's judgment will someday be reversed. So today, Israel is back in the land, but the fulfillment of this promise that we've also read about in Ezekiel has yet to be fulfilled. And that will come at the second coming, right? But in summary, I've already mentioned some of these, but let's just highlight a few really quick insights to remember from the story of Amos. There's a lot, but I narrowed it down to just a few. Number one, be burden bearers on behalf of Jesus. This goes back to what we were talking about, your conversation about praying for those that are in the evil ways, right? That is exactly what Amos did. And we are to do the same for the crooked generation that we live amongst, right? Chapter 2:13 translates to God saying to the people of Israel, I am weighed down by you. God regarded the people of Israel as a weary burden, not as a joy. It is the difference between like the pleasure of a parent that feels when they're dealing with an obedient child and the drudgery of a parent that feels when they're dealing with a stubborn, rebellious child, right? And just as Amos carried the burden of their sin and prayed for God's mercy, we should be doing the same in our culture today, both with believers and unbelievers. One scholar wrote this in regards to justice speaking and injustice as Amos addressed. One scholar wrote, whenever justice is prevented, anytime the rich receive preferential treatment or the poor are oppressed, it burdens the God who sees from heaven and he promises to set it right. Inaction is equal to an oppressive action in the eyes of God. Amos was active in speaking out against it and doing something about it. I think we need to be too. The way a man treats his neighbor reveals his relationship with God, is what Amos is saying here. And just Jesus said the greatest commandment is what? To love God and then love our neighbor. And loving our neighbor means loving those who are oppressed and helping their injustice that they're experiencing. This is the message of Amos. So how are we with carrying those burdens of the weak and fighting on their behalf? Number 2, be aware of carnal ease. It goes back to the verse where I said, woe to you who are at ease, right? Amos prophesied, remember, during an economic prosperity in Israel. And the success in Israel, their successful stature around them allowed them to use their prosperity to gain more prosperity, right? It was for pure self-indulgence. And when God makes us prosperous, we have an absolute obligation to use what he has given us in a way that glorifies him, not pampers ourselves, right? Again, Amos warns them in 6:1, and by extension us, beware of carnal ease. They falsely believed, remember, that their wealth and prosperity was a blessing from God. But what we need to understand is if God blesses us, it is for us for the purpose of being a blessing to others. He does not bless us with something for our own good, but for the good of others. Charles Spurgeon, my favorite, he points out that their carnal ease was a fleshly security. It hardened their hearts. There was no assurance on the rock, but the ease they rested on was like a house tottering from its sandy foundations. He goes on to say that this sinful ease of God's people showed itself in presumption. Maybe list these, because these are things we need to be aware of in our own lives. This is what Charles Spurgeon points out in the nation of Israel at this time. Their ease showed itself in presumption, procrastination, because they were putting away the day of God's judgment because they were doing so good. Israel's sinful ease was shown in cruelty to men and love of self. Because they were comfortable, they were careless. This makes me think of why Paul boasted in his writings about his weakness, the thorn that he was given, right? So that the focus would always be on the need for God. And Jesus said, everyone to whom much was given, of him much will be required, right? By worldly standards, once again, we have been given much. Let us not be comfortable, but always searching for ways to bless others with what we've been given as blessings. But don't let it stop at material goods. Number 3, be responsible with the great gift of salvation we have been given. Simply put, we have been given the greatest gift, salvation, with that gift comes great responsibility, right? As a result of salvation that we have received, Jesus frequently says in his teachings, go and follow me. Go and tell others. Go and make disciples. Go and sin no more. Go sell your possessions. I would challenge you to look at all the ways Jesus said, go, because those are requirements as a result of our salvation. To keep our salvation and knowledge of our future eternity to ourselves and for our own comfort is wrong. It's to be spread. In fact, we do good when we spread it to hasten the day of the Lord. Did you know that? Because in Romans 11:25, it tells us, Paul writes this, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of Gentiles has come in. Let me just read what one scholar writes about that. Israel's hardening will continue until the divinely set number of Gentiles are saved. Some of the people of Israel have hard hearts, but this will only last until the full number of the Gentiles comes to Christ. Our responsibility to lead others to Jesus is part of God's divine plan for his return and restoration of Israel. One scholar that we listen to often, he says, if you want Jesus to come back sooner, then start telling people about Jesus. But in the meantime, number 4, be careful to only measure your life by God's standard of living. The plumb line is a visual picture of the Bible for us. Who or what is the objective of our moral standard in life? We should constantly be evaluating that. Is it government? Is it church bylaws? Which people get caught up in church bylaws that are not biblical. Is it family? Is it culture? Is it popular opinion or belief? Is it your best friend? Is it yourself? What feels right? We've talked about that. My truth, right? I'm just living my truth. The only clear answer of standards to live by is God and his word. God is the only standard, not man, not your truth. I know we talk about this a lot, but we better be evaluating ourselves because the enemy wants to tell us differently in subtle ways that sometimes we won't even see if we're not measuring everything to God's truth. It doesn't matter how it makes us feel. It matters how it makes God feel. And this is why even in the church, there's gender confusion and abortions and divorce and so much more. Amos stresses that righteousness and justice are essential to a healthy society. This is why we have to live by God's standards for that righteousness. And religion is more than observing festival days and holding worship assemblies. True religion demands righteous living. True religion demands righteous living. So let me close with this word again from Paul, the apostle, in Philippians 2, verses 14 through 16, that really aligns very richly with Amos. He says, do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. This is about God saying we need to align with him in ways that look different than that of the world, that of a crooked generation. And as we journey through this twisted world that we're in, we have to seek God and hate evil and love good as God defines it. But distinguishing between the people and the evil, right? Just like we were bringing it back full circle from our conversation. So we need to ask ourselves constantly to evaluate these things. Do we have compassion and pity enough to stop and pray? Does this relationship with Jesus, righteousness, drive us to speak out? Does it drive us to act upon the goodness of God? Because that is what Amos modeled in the midst of corrupt nation. And I feel it aligns with we are being called to as Jesus followers today. So how are we doing at that? And how can we be better at that? Not only as individuals, but as a church.